My name is Ryan Sudo. I currently work at an Asian American social justice nonprofit called the Coalition of Asian American Leaders, based in St. Paul, Minnesota. And I help run operations and event management. So I have my Bachelor of Science in Foreign Service from Georgetown University. So the year of my circumnavigation was in 2016. And I studied Indigenous education policy. My sponsoring chapter was the Washington, D.C. chapter of the Circumnavigators Club. And I traveled to 6 countries in total: Ecuador, Peru, Norway, Taiwan, Australia, and New Zealand. So one of my very first site visits on my whole trip was at the Ministry of Education in Ecuador, which has a department that is solely focused on Indigenous language education and Indigenous cultural education. When I first heard about this department, I found a bunch of their reports. I was reading them before I had even started going on my trip. And the same name, Luis Monteluisa, kept coming up. And I decided I'm going to just try and email this guy and see if I can get a hold of him. Had no success whatsoever until I get to Ecuador itself, and I started talking to another professor at a different university that I had successfully managed to contact. And he basically gave me this guy's number. He said, you should just go ahead and call him, tell him that I said that you're okay, and you can set up an appointment at the actual Department of Education in Quito. So I was so nervous. It took me maybe 20 or 30 minutes to even dial the phone number. I was just practicing in my head the different Spanish phrases that I was going to say, and oh, what if he says something I don't understand? How am I going to get over that? But I was able to make the phone call, set up the appointment, and get myself to this place, and met with a scholar whose whole life had been based on Indigenous education research. What he introduced me to was this concept of framing questions in a way that uplifts these communities versus framing questions in a way that kind of just identifies issues or problems that they might be facing, which a lot of times can be perceived as very negative. In this field, they call it the deficit discourse. It's a way of talking about people only by their weaknesses or in places where they failed to measure up to other groups for whatever reasons, rather than talking about strengths and things that they're bringing to the table. So for me, it was a really good opportunity to kind of look at the questions that I had been proposing. Did I want to ask about why are Indigenous students not enjoying the same high school graduation rates as non-Indigenous students, which is a very deficit discourse heavy framing? Or did I want to frame my questions more in a way that was kind of like, what can Indigenous cultures bring to education that we're not recognizing? And what are the ways that Indigenous people identify success in their various communities? And of course, that varies from community to community. But I think helping me frame my questions in a more positive way also got people to kind of trust me more in my process, and definitely helped me just think about things from another perspective. The coolest thing about it was the whole thing is almost entirely, just like the US, very bureaucratic, a lot of people in suits, a lot of official looking buildings. But as soon as I got off the elevator at the floor of Indigenous education policy, all of a sudden, the entire staff, the layout, the design was more kind of based on Indigenous Ecuadorian culture. You had people in traditional ponchos and like campesino hats, walking around this more like modern office environment. And I saw a lot of people who were Indigenous themselves, who didn't look like, the city dwelling Ecuadorians that were kind of, forming a lot of other education policy. So that was just a really unique experience. And being in the room where the policy is actually made as, an outsider, as a 21-year-old, as someone who was just new to researching things, it kind of gave me a new lease on my project. Like I felt like I could really do anything with this grant. It was just really exciting opportunity. Stay in Lima, I was trying some famous Peruvian dish. I think it's lomo saltado. It's kind of like a beef and rice dish, just in a restaurant. And I saw on TV there had been a surfing competition in Peru, in which this world champion surfer had won first place. She was from Peru. She was kind of a local legend. I didn't really think much of it until the next day when I was walking by the beach. I saw her practicing, and it was the funniest thing because I went up to her to try and just tell her that I had seen her on TV and how I thought that was really cool. But she was a little over the fanboying and fangirling of her various people who had come up to her. So it was kind of a brisk encounter, and she was kind of questioning, like, how do you even know who I am? I just told her that I saw her on TV, and then she kind of warmed up a little bit, and she realized I was just another fan. I was just trying to talk to her. It was just kind of a funny situation though, because I kind of realized, wow, anything can happen while I'm on this trip. One thing that I made sure that I did during my circumnavigators, although it was a very research heavy trip, was that I made sure to take time to rest and do some kind of more touristy things that I would probably never in my life have another opportunity to do. So once, when I was traveling in Tromsø, which is kind of in the Arctic region of Norway, I kind of saw on the map, it was very, very close to this place called the Treriksrøset, which is like the 3-country cairn. It's where Norway, Sweden, and Finland all touch each other. And the hostel that I was staying at had offered to drive people staying at the hostel over to this point. And you could just kind of stand on this little monument that they had built. You're in 3 countries at once. It's, you take a funny picture, that's about it. At the time, I was wondering if it was really worth the excursion. I was just getting to Tromsø. I was trying to set my bearings and stuff. But I decided to take the trip, and it was a really, really great, unique experience. It's the middle of summer, so it's 24 hours of sunlight in Norway. It's late at night, but we're still able to see the sun. We get there, it's a little chilly. It's about mid-50s, which is about as warm as it gets in that region. And I was able to stand on top of this little pillar in 3 different countries and hold up the circumnavigator's flag. So I think that might be the record. I don't know, you'll have to ask other people how many countries at the same time they've held this flag, but I made sure to get a picture to show the foundation. When I was in Taipei, I visited Zhengzhou University, which is one of the main universities in Taipei, and they are actually responsible for creating all of the indigenous language textbooks and identifying which indigenous languages the Taiwanese government wants to recognize in the country. So when I traveled there, I met some of the people who were developing those textbooks. They showed me their process. They showed me notes from conferences that they had been to. They treated me to Starbucks. It was a really, really humbling situation, because I kind of realized that a lot of these scholars are just so excited to share about their work, even if it's to a 21-year-old from the United States that they've just met for the first time. And I was really, really grateful to have that opportunity just to learn from academics in Taiwan and also across the world. Georgetown University is a Jesuit university, and they have kind of this loose Jesuit network connection around the world with other institutions that are also part of the Jesuit network. Once I saw that there was this Jesuit-focused Aboriginal school in Sydney, I thought it would be really, really great to try and reach out to their staff and just kind of forge that connection. When you're in the circumnavigator's mindset, you're really just kind of trying to use every single possible leg up you can to get these connections and find site visits and people to talk to. So I was able to travel to this really, really great school in Sydney who only accepts 20 pupils a year. They're really focused on at-risk youth, and their whole idea is about how to kind of reform Australian education away from the mindset where the state is creating guidelines that everyone has to follow, and this is exactly how you're supposed to teach a child, to changing that to more of a culturally accessible and culturally mindful curriculum, using things like ancestral knowledge in Aboriginal communities and passing them down to these kids, talking about academic subjects in a context that kids who maybe did not grow up in a urban environment might be familiar with in Australia, using things like Indigenous storytelling to try and forge those connections to the material for these kids. And it was a really, really interesting, great experience just to see how Not only were educators working with Aboriginal youth, but also tying it into kind of the Jesuit border and the Jesuit beliefs of, just caring for the whole person, which is something that I also learned about while at Georgetown. And when I was in Hamilton, New Zealand, I met with a researcher who was a Maori woman. And after explaining my whole project to her about my intentions for studying Indigenous education policy, she really challenged me and kind of questioned why I was even going about my project. I kind of had thought the whole time that more research would be a good thing, that it would be helpful to these communities, because here's someone from the outside trying to do more to understand challenges in Indigenous education policy and the harm that it might be causing to these populations. But from her perspective, having outsiders come in, people that are unknown to the community, people that maybe don't have enough experience in life, to just come in and ask all of these kind of invasive questions as part of research sometimes necessitates. I think it really rubbed her the wrong way. She told me that I really needed to spend more time thinking about whether or not I was actually contributing to a problem, which was, over the centuries, outsiders coming in trying to solve problems for these Indigenous groups. And I think that really made me take a step back and reevaluate how I was going about my project. I don't know if it's really a question that I was able to 100% answer, but it certainly provided a lens through which to view the rest of my project. One of the maybe great things about circumnavigators is that you really don't have anyone over your shoulder telling you when you're doing something stupid. And that kind of gives you room to make mistakes that you then learn from. When I was in Otavalo, Ecuador, I decided that I really wanted to try this hike and find a very famous tree called El Lechero, which is apparently a landmark in that region. I went on this hike, got lost. My phone did not really have the right kind of GPS setup to help me navigate. And I started to feel a little panic because it was in a more remote area. There weren't really any people around to help me kind of find the way back. But as I was wandering around, I did start noticing in the distance there were some farmers tending to their crops. And a lot of them are from the indigenous groups in Ecuador, and they speak Quechua, which is not a language that I had any experience with or any knowledge base of. Even though Ecuador is a primarily Spanish-speaking country, in a lot of the indigenous areas, people don't really have Spanish language education. They kind of navigate their whole lives in the Quechua language. So, even though I spoke some Spanish, it was not very helpful in the situation. And, speaking with a farmer trying to find the way back to the road, I kind of resorted back to body language or facial expressions, the same way that maybe a 2 or a 3-year-old would communicate. But what I kind of found out was that even just letting myself look kind of silly and use unexpected ways to communicate with people was actually pretty effective in trying to find my way back. At the very minimum, I was able to sort of understand from what the person was gesturing. I was able to understand kind of which direction I needed to go. And I think that kind of made me realize you can spend a lot of time memorizing vocabulary and trying to master language, but in the most basic situations, sometimes it's just instincts that can help you communicate with a person the most effective way. So another thing that happens when you're traveling all over the world is people want to introduce you to their local delicacies and want to see how you react to them. And probably the most offensive smelling thing that I tried on my whole trip was stinky tofu, which was what I tried in Taiwan. It has this really unique kind of almost rancid odor that comes from fermentation. And it turns a lot of foreigners off, I think, which is why the local person that I met in Taiwan was so excited for me to try it. I have kind of a rule when I'm traveling that I have to try at least everything once or twice. The first time just to see what it's like, the second time to make sure that I didn't like it or that I did like it. And what I found with stinky tofu was that the smell was absolutely awful. It was what everybody said, but the taste was, actually okay. It kind of just tasted like normal braised tofu, with a little bit of like a extra funky, kind of like almost like a blue cheese kind of taste, I feel like. But it was definitely a fun way to relax. And that was something I tried to do every place that I went. Just try and see what local people were eating and make sure that I made the most of it. So while I was in Wellington, New Zealand, I also had this great opportunity to meet with educators who were non-Indigenous. A lot of them were just white New Zealanders who were just trying to find new ways to connect to their Maori students. And so they were all collectively taking a Maori language class, which my connection at the university in Wellington was able to let me attend. The lesson that I attended was all about how do you ask for people to pass you things. And the way that they had practiced was they had all brought snacks, kind of like a potluck. And they just asked each other, can you pass me the hummus? Can you pass me the chips? Can you pass me this? For some reason now, I always will remember, please pass me the hummus in the Maori language. Like that is one phrase that for some reason just stuck with me. Even 5 years later, it's anete humu. And what I really think was cool about that whole class was just that it showed that we all have work that we can do to try and connect to Indigenous populations, or just even communities we're not familiar with, even if it's not an Indigenous group. Maybe it's just, an immigrant group in your local community that you can take a little time to get to know more about. It doesn't have to be language classes even, it could just be a conversation. I was really inspired seeing the work that these teachers were doing to just try and forge like one extra layer of connection so that they could help their students. So my circumnavigator's topic was on Indigenous education policy. And I think the word Indigenous kind of implies a relationship to land, being a native person to that place. So a lot of times in order to meet Indigenous communities where they're at, you have to travel to their home Indigenous land. And that was the opportunity that Circumnavigators Foundation really gave me. I wasn't just in big cities. I was making sure that I took the time to go kind of to more rural areas, to places where Indigenous culture was more prevalent. And I think having that opportunity gave me access to perspectives that I wasn't seeing in books when I was, just studying at a university in the United States. I was challenged by people whose experiences, lived experiences were very different from mine, who were approaching their education policy and their livelihoods not as an academic subject like I was, but as a matter of necessity and a matter of importance that affected their everyday lives and the future of their children. And I think having access to those firsthand perspectives really grounded my research and brought some human faces and some humanity into the topics that I was talking about. And it definitely, I think, challenged me to think about my own role in the world and as a researcher, how to best go about studying topics. Going into the following academic year, what my Circumnavigators grant really allowed me to do was have a base of research that I was really familiar with and have some experience using those research skills, which I then was able to apply to classes and papers that I was working on in my senior year. When we were having discussions in Latin American history class or in Southeast Asian history class, there were things that I had learned from my trip that I was able to contribute to class discussions. And I think that added confidence and experience that I was able to apply to my coursework was really something that helped me excel academically as well. I was no longer just basing my knowledge off of books I had maybe read. I was actually basing knowledge off of lived experience and travel experience that I had gathered thanks to the Circumnavigators Foundation. And that was something I think that kind of helped me feel like I had more ethos and more credibility when going into these talks with, a lot of times are really smart students that sometimes you feel intimidated by. Like I felt like I finally had a place among those students that I was going to class with. So in the last 5 years since I went on my Circumnavigators grant journey, I first moved to Taiwan to work full time at a travel company where I was also working on my Mandarin skills. But after a while, I was thinking more about how I wanted to use my global opportunities and experience to contribute to my own community and my hometown. So I moved back to Minnesota this year and decided to work at a nonprofit helping the Asian community in Minnesota. I think especially given this year with rising anti-Asian hate crimes and the struggles of the coronavirus pandemic that every community has been struggling with. It's been a really great opportunity to get back to my roots and try to contribute all of the great opportunities I've had to a cause that means something to me and kind of give back to the community that raised me. We're used to saying it's a small world, everyone's the same, but I think what I walked away with the most is that it's diverse. There are so many things, so many people happening all at the same time. And we're lucky if we get to grasp only a fraction of that. So my hope is that even though I've had the Circumnavigators experience, you know, I've realized that that's really only a glimpse of everything that Earth has to offer. And I hope to continue in my future career, my future endeavors, to just keep uncovering more and more of what is existing on this planet with me. My circumnavigation helped me trust myself better because it was maybe the first time in my life that I had ever managed such a huge project. The foundation granted me with $9,000, which I was pretty much entrusted to budget on my own. I was traveling alone for more than 80 days in all of these different countries, speaking different languages, interacting with different scholars. There were a lot of things that I had never done before. And I think at the beginning of my trip, I struggled a lot with this idea of I forget what it's called. It's this idea that you're not really imposter syndrome. I struggled a lot with the idea of imposter syndrome, which is the idea that you're not really qualified to be doing the work that you're doing. You somehow kind of through some mistake have stumbled into this situation that you're in, and everybody kind of entrusts you to come up with these great results. So at the beginning, while I was a little nervous, I also had to challenge myself and just get all of these projects done. And what I really found out was that I learned by doing. I had never scheduled an interview at a Ministry of Education, but somehow I did it. And I had never traveled to, an Indigenous village by myself, but somehow I did it. And once I started building up those experiences, they kind of supported one another. And I was able to use my past success to then encourage myself, to challenge myself to complete the next tasks. So I'm really just grateful that in such a short time, in one Circumnavigators trip, I was able to have so many experiences that built up my confidence. The biggest challenges for me for the Circumnavigators grant was that number one, I had to move to a new place almost every week or every 2 weeks. That's just kind of the nature of the structure. And through that, I was meeting so many new people, research contacts, people I was interviewing, people I was meeting at hostels, tour guides, people at the airport, service workers. For somebody who prefers to kind of just keep a close circle and not really expand myself socially that much, it was really, really challenging to put myself out there over and over and over again to just make the connections that I need to do for my project. And after a while, I really kind of just felt a little burnt out. It was maybe a month in, I was tired, there was jet lag issues, I'm sure that contributed. But I kind of got to this point where I just needed to be antisocial for, a few days and just not have any appointments, not try to hang out with people that I just met at the hostel, just kind of focus on myself. And, allow myself that space. I think that there's a lot of pressure when you're entrusted with this grant to be making the most of every single day and really pushing yourself to be, busy all the time. Obviously, it's a very unique experience, so that makes a lot of sense. But I think for me, it was important to realize that pushing myself every single day was not really sustainable. I had to take a couple of days off just to refresh myself and kind of revive my enthusiasm for the project. And because I did that, I was able to tackle the second half of my project with the same energy that I did the first half. Every year, I realize more and more things that are a part of myself that stem from my circumnavigator's trip. There is nothing like being a 21-year-old and just getting sent out into the world on such a massive undertaking to really shape how you tackle problems and how you make decisions in life. I feel like any kind of stumble or challenge that faces me in my life, whether it's personal or professional, if I compare it to the circumnavigators project that I did, it all of a sudden doesn't seem to be like such a massive obstacle in my way. I'm able to break it down into pieces and try to tackle it just the same way that I did with my grant to make sure that I'm successful in achieving whatever goal I want. And I also think that, having that experience has just, again, allowed me to have some confidence when navigating the world. Every day, the world is changing and we're facing new situations, new problems that people living today have to deal with. And those same problem solving skills that I used during my circumnavigator's trip, I think are going to be the skills that I use when tackling when tackling new problems that I encounter in my life. The biggest piece of advice I can give to future grantees would be that you need to make sure that in addition to your research, you are being intentional about taking care of yourself on this trip, and that you are leaving room for fun. Yes, you're being entrusted with a lot of resources, and that's really great for creating a research project, but just remember, you're still an undergraduate student, you're only 21, no one is expecting you to win a Nobel Prize for this research. What you really need to do is make the most of it and take care of yourself. What I mean by that is just making sure that you can get through your whole circumnavigation and end up with a product that you're happy with. I think that I struggled a lot with pressure on my trip, thinking that I had to be perfect, that my research had to be this amazing thing. And while I'm certainly proud of the work that I did, I kind of realized that that wasn't the only way that I was going to walk away from this grant. I wanted to have a great product, but I also was really grateful to have that experience of traveling. And I think that the Circumnavigators Foundation is really supportive of that. If someone were interacting with a person from a different cultural background for the very first time, I think it's most important to just listen and come into the conversation without any presuppositions about what they think or how they're going to act. It's also important to recognize that we have our own cultural background that we have been immersed in our entire lives, and that's not something that goes away. So being able to recognize what facets of our behavior, our speech, our personalities are parts of our own upbringing is really important, because then, when you start to realize that the other person doesn't share that with you, it becomes less of a personal thing and more just kind of the product of the different ways that you were raised and the different ways you grew up. If I had met somebody who had never heard of the Circumnavigators Foundation or the Circumnavigators Grant, I would tell them that it is a unique experience that they will never be able to access probably in the rest of their lives. The Circumnavigators Foundation is a group of very committed, experienced world travelers who are looking to invest in young people and invest in research experiences that are going to make the world a better place and that is going to contribute to academic discourse. So if you're somebody that enjoys research, if you have a dream of traveling and seeing the world, if you want to combine those two things, then you really do have to apply.